you for joining our webinar this evening. The topic this evening is the top 10 faults that occurred during driving tests between April 2022 and March 2023. And our session tonight is being recorded, so don't worry if you miss any of it or you need to leave early. The whole thing's been recorded and that will be shared with everybody following the session. Also, if you haven't already, it may be a good idea to grab a notepad and pen to make some notes as we go through. In a moment, I'll introduce you to our presenters, Amanda and Graham. They're going to present for about 15 to 20 minutes on the top 10 faults. And during that time, they'll be posing some questions for you to think about, which is why it might be a good idea to grab that pad and pen now. And then after the presentation, we'll be opening it up for you to ask your questions in the Q&A session. And we'll be doing that through the Q&A window. If you look at the top right area of your screen and your team screen, you'll see a Q&A box. At the moment, that's not active, but when we get to the Q&A section, we'll be switching that on. So you click on there and you open the Q&A window and you'll be able to type your questions in then. So now I'd like to ask Amanda and Graham to introduce themselves. Let's start with Amanda.
Hi all, thank you for joining us. So Amanda Lane, for those that don't know me, Head of Driver Testing and Training Policy. I've been with the DVSA since about 2011. I joined as a driving examiner and prior to that I was an ADI, so I have been in the position you guys are in, which is good. From there I went on to be an LDTM and an ODM, so I've got a good idea of the delivery of driving tests and how that works operationally, and then I moved across to policy and into the role I'm in now for about a year ago. So that's my background. And I'll hand you over to Graham.
Thanks, Amanda. Good evening, everybody. Graham O'Brien, DVSA. Been with the agency about 17 years now. Similar to Amanda, I was an ADI prior to that for 5 years. Worked in various roles within the agency, from examiner through to staff instructor. Now currently working in policy for around the last 8 years. Been lucky enough to work on some of the bigger implementations as SatNav and whatnot, and more recently the iPad. But looking forward to speaking to everyone again tonight and hopefully enjoy the webinar.
Great. Well, thanks, Graham and Amanda. So let's get on with this presentation. I'm going to hand over to Amanda to start.
So we're going to talk about why it's important to discuss the reasons about the top 10 faults made in driving tests. Are we going to move the slides on? Sorry. Thank you. Okay, so many of these reasons also are contributing factors within reported collisions. So that's why it's important that we look at these within the driving test as well as outside of it. And so tonight is much more about driving as a whole, not just about the test and passing the test. Understanding these reasons can help assess if pupils have the skills and knowledge and that basic understanding that they need to be safe when they've passed their test. They'll give you a great way of exploring factors with your pupils that will increase risk in different scenarios. And it's that last point that's the most important here, really, is we're all probably have a very good understanding of what technically needs to be done. You're all very good at what you do, but this is about digging into the pupil's understanding of risk, and it can give you a much better sense of their thoughts, feelings and beliefs. So it's about digging into what they think is a risk, what we think is a risk, and then trying to line that up. So on the slide now, you'll see some examples of different risk factors. And this can come down to personality. As we know, various personalities brings out different driving abilities, different driving skills, which leads on to confidence. Some people's personality gives additional confidence, some a lot less in confidence. Stress, mood and emotions, especially around exam times for our students and things, that can lead to different driving abilities. Risk perception, so what I think is a risk and what somebody else thinks is a risk could be slightly different, and quite often that can be because of sitting by parents and that sort of thing. So helping them understand risk is quite a big thing quite often. Hazard perception, what do they see being a hazard? Mental workload as well, especially our younger novice drivers. Sometimes there's so much pressure on them to do so much now. So where are they in that headspace at that time? Distractions, we can all be quite easily distracted at times, but quite often, you know, what's going on around us, what's going on away from the car, what's going on in their personal lives, it can all affect how they're driving. Fatigue, we can all get quite tired. Alcohol and drugs, technology, that can be quite a distraction, and the road environment in general, the weather, what's going on, and are they in a new environment, are they in an environment they're used to driving in, and all those sorts of things. So we're going to go through each of the top 10 reasons, and you might want to take your own notes because you can jot down about how these risk factors could contribute to faults in that area. And make notes about the types of questions you could ask to explore your pupils' attitude and their thinking process, thought process, and where they are. You might want to use some probing questions to explore your pupils' thoughts and feelings about these in the context of faults. So, for example, you could ask them, why do you think people fail to make effective observations at junctions? And then probe into that a little bit further around the risk factors that your pupil mentions. And you could clarify questions by sort of reframing them and putting them back to them. So if I've understood that correctly, are you saying this, this, and this? And then that shows that we're sort of understanding what they're telling us and also making sure that we understand what they're trying to tell us. So you can go on to introduce other risk factors that they haven't mentioned into the conversation to see what they think and feel about those. Because quite often there's other things that they might not think of. So asking them the questions, leading them to come up with where they need to go helps them to engage in that process. We'll keep the list of risk factors in the corner of each slide as we progress, so you've got them as a prompt. And as Dane said in the introduction, we'll make the recording of today's session available after, so if you want to recap any section later, you'll be able to do that. So we'll now move into the top 10. Number 1 is not making effective observations at junctions. So failing to judge the speed of an approaching vehicle, it's quite a common one really, especially when they only have a very quick look and they make that decision very quickly. They may have misjudged the speed of that approaching car. Making no effective observations at all. As experienced drivers, we sometimes think that that's not a possible thing to do, but it is on tests and it does happen. And sometimes that's just because, again, they've been distracted by something else and they're out of a junction before they've realised. Making no observations when joining a dual carriageway from a slip road. And again, this can be due to distraction because they're coming down a slip road and it takes a little while for them to realise that they're joining that dual carriageway and those observations they need to take. Going straight ahead at crossroads, again, this comes up quite a bit in test. So they're well marked crossroads, so they're not looking at the road markings, they're seeing the road ahead. And so maybe that's that questioning, isn't it? Where were they looking? Well, I was looking ahead, so they hadn't seen the junction because their sight was ahead of that. Looking too late, that quite often happens, or repeatedly not looking left when turning left. It's that instant reaction, isn't it, to look right and they're out of the junction and over those white lines before they've taken any checks to the left, which does cause problems. So we think about the possible risk factors. Which do you think might be most relevant in each of those different scenarios? What sort of probing questions might you use to explore your pupils' attitudes? You can coach them not to make those mistakes. That's what we were talking about. Where were they looking? What were they looking for? What else was happening? What were they thinking as they approached that junction? Talk them through that thinking process. So let's take the example of entering a roundabout with a vehicle approaching from the right. So there's a lot to think about going into that, and quite often as experienced drivers we do this quite often without having to break down that thinking process, but for them, they're coming in, if they're in a manual car, they've got the speed, changing gears, they've got their mirrors, they've got to be looking, and it's all can be quite rushed because of the approach. So it's about talking that through with them, and getting them to assess the speed, the distance of that approaching vehicle. Where are they looking? Who are they looking for? Have they looked for cyclists? Have they looked for walkers? So it's a lot to take in. But by asking those questions, you can ascertain where they were looking, what they were doing, what they were thinking. And then that hopefully will reveal what they were most worried about. Were they worried about the vehicles queuing behind them? And if so, is that's what's made them pull out? And quite often you hear that in debriefs on driving tests is, they're like, oh, well, I thought I had to go because I've waited too long, or there's too many cars behind me. So, how do we work through that with them? And is it that anxious feeling that's making them react in that way? And that could affect their decisions at that time. So that's one. Number 2, not using mirrors when changing direction. So this would be about not using mirrors when exiting a roundabout. So if we've turned right at a roundabout, we've used the right-hand lane, and then as we're coming across to exit the roundabout, we've just moved back across the left lane and left the roundabout with no checks across to the left at all, which is really quite high risk, and again is worth that discussion. Causing a vehicle to slow when changing lanes on a dual carriageway, or trying to change lane on a roundabout when a vehicle is directly alongside you. So again, it's talking through the risks. What are the risks of doing that? What are the risks of not checking? And you know, what might be the risks in those that are most relevant in each of those different scenarios. So if they're following their own sat nav, and some of them tell you which lane to be in, ones on test don't, but some of them do. It could be that they're watching the sat nav's now telling them they're going to go right on the roundabout, they need to be in the right hand lane, and so they're busy watching the sat nav and they just move on the dual carriageway into the right hand lane without any checks at all. You know, is it the sat nav that stopped them from checking their mirrors? Is it because they were quite close to the roundabout and they reacted? You know, so it's asking them those questions to try and understand why they did what they did, and what they could do in the future, you know, to help them not do that again. And ask them why. Why is always a good question. Or was it they were just anxious about being in the wrong place at the wrong time and approach to that roundabout? Or were they frightened, maybe worried about going the wrong way? And what's at the root of that fear? What's driving that worry? And then you can think about what types of questions you might ask to explore those thoughts a bit and feelings a bit further within those scenarios. So I'm going to hand over to Graham now for number 3.
Thanks, Amanda. I was just thinking we maybe should have done that in reverse order, shouldn't we? Like the chart, starting at number 10 down to number 1. But hey ho. So number 3, moving off safely. No surprise that this is in the top 10, isn't it? Really, with what we see with novice drivers in terms of moving away. One of the things that sometimes strikes me on when I'm conducting driving tests is that occasionally it appears that candidates aren't fully aware how often we stop on a driving test. I think that does push the mock test again in terms of highlighting the content, what to expect on the driving test. You know, these stops, if you think about it, we're stopping up to 4 or 5 times on a driving test. They do come quite thick and fast. So that can sometimes be a bit, you know, off-putting for a candidate, I guess, when they're not doing that quite as much on a lesson. So again, a real good push for the mock test there. So some of the common ones that we see, you know, from behind apart vehicles, so as we call it, the angle start. Obviously, there's a higher risk with this one, isn't there? You know, you've got that judgment of the oncoming vehicles, the judgment of the following vehicles. I think we often see candidates taking reasonable observations, but not necessarily judging how long it's going to take them to move out from that position. We've got that spatial awareness as well in terms of the oncoming vehicle. You know, so it is a common one where we do see faults moving away from the parked cars on the driving test. Of course, this is one where we see it repeated in terms of an habitual fault where we you know, somebody might not check the blind spot throughout or just be limited with the mirror checks. So we do occasionally see this in an habitual form happening throughout the test repeatedly. You know, and it's about, and you know, you folks do this, but I know when I was instructing, sometimes my pupils would come back from a test and they would say, I could hear your voice in my head throughout the test, you know, because that's what they're used to. They're used to hearing your voice, whether it be that prompt, that Q&A. So occasionally as a coping strategy, I used to say, well, use your own voice, talk yourself through it, you know, think about your procedure, just take that little bit extra time. When you do these stops, that's an opportunity just to catch your breath. I'll often say to a candidate, right, and breathe, just relax, take a few seconds, compose yourself, get back into your routine, because it's all about not being in your routine on a test, isn't it? It knocks you off your stride. So the more you can get back into that routine, the better. Take a little bit of time just to compose yourself. There's no rush. Occasionally as well, and I'll mention this, I do see on a lot of the tests I do where candidates are a bit reluctant to go into neutral and handbrake. That doesn't help. That doesn't help them because they're not getting into a full routine then to move back off from that starting position, if you like, of going through that routine of clutch, first gear, MSM, PSL, all that good stuff. Occasionally, it's almost like the reluctant handbrake and neutral, just keep the clutch down on the brake. It's not the best starting point. It can lead to other issues. So some of the other things we see, moving away from the right hand side, of course the risk is higher there, isn't it, when we're crossing the other traffic? So it arguably requires a much more sufficient, significant amount of rear observations to ensure it's safe before moving off. The other one we see, which is after the emergency stop, and it's understandable in terms of the emergency stop itself will get the adrenaline going, it will get the emotions rattled slightly. So again, it's really important as a coping strategy just to take that little bit of time, talk yourself through what you need to do if necessary, because we'll quite often see candidates, you know, when the examiner will turn and say, thank you, I won't ask you to do that again, drive on when you're ready, literally select first gear and drive off without any rear observations whatsoever. That leaves the examiner with no choice, doesn't it? That's a high risk maneuver where the examiner ultimately, more often than not, unless there's a mitigating circumstances, would have to mark a serious fault, potentially dangerous if there's other vehicles involved. So the risk involved in that exercise when moving away from the side of the road is obviously very high, and it would be assessed accordingly. So there's nothing more frustrating for an examiner, I can tell you, when somebody moves away without doing that rear observation, when you know it's out of character with the rest of their drive. So the advice there really, isn't it, it's just trying to take that little bit of time to calm the emotions, which inevitably will be high at that point after an emergency stop. So we move into number 4. So incorrect position when turning right at junctions. We occasionally refer to this as POSR, position turning right. Again, a common fault, I guess, for obvious reasons. So things we tend to see, not taking the correct position at a roundabout. So I guess why is the question, isn't it? And sometimes that could be a lack of planning and planning when coming up a roundabout, or maybe it might be a slightly unusual layout. I guess the thing I would always say here is if a candidate's in any doubt whatsoever, ask the examiner for clarification, even if it's following the sat-nav. Just get that clarification if you're unsure where you're actually turning. Is it a right turn? How many lanes are there? If there's only 2 lanes, invariably you would be expected to be in the right-hand lane unless markings dictate otherwise. But we do see people turning right from the left-hand lane on a roundabout. Coming back to that risk again, that's potentially high risk, isn't it? It couldn't be any further from what we call the defined outcome. So again, it's very difficult for the examiner not to mark that as a high risk fault unless the circumstances dictate otherwise. So yeah, it's all about that planning, isn't it, on the approach to try to scan and plan. And if there's any uncertainty, get clarification from the examiner. So obstructing traffic when turning right is fairly self-explanatory there. When you want to turn right at the end of the road, you're in correct position to the left. So this will often come in a one-way street, if turning right from the left-hand lane, again, a fault we see quite often. So generally coming back to that, clarification of where we're going, trying to scan and plan nice and early and seeking clarification if it's required. I think I hand back to Amanda for number 5.
Thanks, Graham. So number 5, not having proper control of the steering. It sort of is what it says, but that's easier said than done. So it's repeatedly not steering enough or steering late on the approach to junctions when turning left. So we see it quite regularly. People come up to a junction and they're going to turn left, but they come up quite straight. Why? It's probably just because they're distracted by what's going on. They know they're going to turn left. They can see the end of the road. They know they've got to look. So they've already moved on that thinking process. And because they've not steered around to the left, they've now opened themselves up to things coming down the inside of them, or when they then enter quite a narrow road, they're having to do a lot of steering then to stay on their side of the road because they haven't got the room to get it all in. So that's one of the things we see. The other one is not steering enough when going around a bend. So this would mean that they're then having to react a lot later or brake, or which then puts the risk up. As we know with bends come with a lot of risk, and especially on the rural roads. So having that experience of knowing when to steer on the bends and how much to steer to follow the road around safely is really quite important. Steering left when turning right into a main steering late when turning right into a minor road. So we call this swan necking, and that's just where they've come past it, they've steered in, and then because they've got so much right steering on, because they're quite late steering, they've now ended up on the right hand side of the road. Now they've got to steer to come back to the left. It's a lot of pressure for them, because suddenly now the car's all over the place. They've got to steer quickly to the right, steer quickly to the left. It's a lot of pressure, and it's a lot of anxiety for them they don't need, because now they're trying to get back on the correct side of the road, and with that comes with a lot of risk, because now they're on the incorrect side of the road where something could be approaching. Repeatedly mounting the pavement when pulling up on the left. We do see this quite a bit. Some of them, they catch the edge of a dropped curb, which is slightly different, but then others we do get that manage to mount quite high curbs, which I'm sure you don't want them doing in your nice cars. But yeah, so that's what we do see, is that they will mount the pavement. And steering late when moving out to pass parked vehicles. Again, this comes with risk, because we're getting quite close to those parked cars. It's putting themselves under unnecessary pressure as well, because they're now having to do a lot of steering, and again then that puts the car further out into the road than it needs to be, and if they've got an oncoming vehicle, so it becomes a lot of things to deal with all very quickly, and in a short space of time. So that gradual steering in plenty of time is a much better place to be, really. So, and it comes down to that planning, isn't it? It's looking ahead, seeing what you're going to do. Okay, can I just gradually move myself out now so I'm alongside that parked car, rather than be on top of it and it's like, oh, there's a parked car now, I've got to get out around it. So and I know when I was teaching and you'd ask them, how do we end up in that situation, because I didn't see it. So we look ahead, we plan, that's what we do, and it's just helping them to do the same. So that's around not having proper control of the steering. And then number 6 is not responding appropriately to traffic lights. So failing to react to a red traffic light sounds really obvious, but actually the ones that we find they struggle with the most is roundabouts. So where I test down in the West Country, they seem to put traffic lights on every big roundabout. I'm not quite sure why. So they're waiting at a traffic light on the roundabout that's red, it goes to green, off they go, and we're turning right. So they go through the first one on green, but what they haven't realised now is there's another one just around as they go around the roundabout, and they haven't seen that, because what they're actually thinking now is, okay, I need to change lanes, I need to think about leaving the roundabout, I need to get my signal on, I need to check my mirrors. So they're doing all that, and then we're going through the next traffic light, which is red, so having to brake for them. So that's quite a common one, because like I say, they're just distracted by what else is going on around them. The other one I see a few times is where they've reacted to the green light, say turning right at traffic lights, they've turned right, and then as they've turned in that, there's been a light for another set of traffic, maybe coming from the opposite direction, and they've now stopped in the junction because they can see a red light that's not for them. So again, that's a good area to cover off there, because when they're stopping then in the middle of a junction unnecessarily, the traffic behind them sounding their horns and things. So, and it's really risky, because that no one's expecting you to stop there. So there's a couple of times that we're finding they don't react to those red lights. Stopping after the first white line when there are advanced stop lines for cyclists. So yeah, the first stop line, that's where they should be behind. And I think again, they just get a little bit distracted and they roll with maybe without realising it. So they carry on rolling, and before you know it, they're in the cyclist box, and we're not allowed to be there. So not progressing when you're waiting to turn right at a junction and it's safe to proceed. Again, it's when sometimes what they'll do is they'll stop behind the line because the traffic's oncoming. They don't see that they can move ahead into the middle of the junction and wait there for the gap to go. And because there's no green arrow on quite a few traffic lights, it confuses them, I think, with all the other things that are going on around them. They've got to think about and take in. And I think sometimes they try and refer it back to a set of lights they know, and then they try and treat all traffic light junctions the same, and of course they're not. So it's just helping them to take each one as they get to it, and not going ahead when a green light is showing and the junction ahead is clear. Yeah, that sounds quite obvious, but it does happen. We do get people sat at green traffic lights, unfortunately, and again, I think it's just because their mind's in a different place. They might not be watching. It was red on the approach when they first checked, they've since come to a stop, and that sort of thing. So yeah, it's and then going ahead when the green traffic light is shown but the junction is not clear. So yeah, that's when they're then moving into a situation that creates risk to other people around them. And so it's getting them to make those decisions a little bit earlier, plan, look ahead and see what they need to be doing. So that's for traffic lights. I'm going to hand you back to Graham.
Thanks, Amanda. I think we're on number 7, which is, not responding to traffic signs. So again, and I'm sure what we're saying to you folks is, is nothing that you're not already aware of, but hopefully it's reassuring in terms of, what you're doing out there is kind of the right thing in terms of some of the things we're seeing. And I know candidates tend to have traits, don't they, or patterns in their driving that maybe manifest throughout the drive in typical areas, if you like, and it's trying to find those right coping strategies, isn't it, to allow them to deal with that when the pressure's on, when they're in that kind of mindset where they're not thinking maybe as clearly as they would on a lesson. And I do come back to that, and I do get candidates who said, "Oh, do you mind if I just talk myself through things?" Absolutely. If that works, really adopt that, because I think when it comes to traffic signs, the key thing is not spotting them, isn't it? It's not spotting them early enough and reacting to them in time, or just not spotting them at all. So that can just be where the mind starts to cloud in that test environment, and you're just not looking up enough to actually see what's happening. And that's where I think candidates fall foul of some of these typical ones that we get on the left. Probably the most obvious one, the stop sign. Every candidate knows they need to stop. So they either didn't see the sign if they didn't stop, or they thought they stopped and do a rolling emerge. So either way, the examiner's hands are obviously tied. It's a legal requirement. So that and again, it's frustrating for an examiner. Trust me, if a candidate just rolls a stop sign, if you like, and they've driven well, the fact that that is breaching a legal requirement. So scanning and planning, absolutely the key, as you folks know, to incorporate in that into the drive for spotting the traffic signs. Same for bus lanes, isn't it? We tend to get the opposite in terms of if a bus lane can be used, candidates tend to stay out of them, but occasionally they will go in when they shouldn't do if the traffic sign's there and clearly. I think it's a key thing to say as well that with traffic signs, if there is any ambiguity, the examiner will clarify that. If the signs aren't as clear as they should be, the examiner will step in and help with that. Choosing the wrong lane at a roundabout, that's probably the common one. You might have 3 lanes and they choose the wrong lane, which is clearly signed, and it needs to be clearly signed on a traffic sign prior and on the approach to the roundabout. So if a candidate puts themselves in the wrong lane and then proceeds to go the wrong way from that lane, again, procedurally, that couldn't be any further from the defined outcome. Potentially, there may be other vehicles involved, which will, that will be part of the examiner's assessment. Was anyone affected? How far from the defined outcome were they? Was it potentially high risk? And what awareness did the candidate show to actually being in the incorrect position? Occasionally, we'll see people get in the incorrect position and try to rectify it. And of course, that depends how they do it. Do they do it safely? Quite often that will lead to a different fault. Someone will realise they're in the wrong lane, then rashly change lanes without taking effective observations before changing lanes. And quite often that can lead to something else. So the cause may have been the traffic sign, late reaction to it, but the effect was actually the changing of direction. So quite often you'll hear we talk about, we mark the cause unless the effect was greater. So acting late or reacting late to speed limit changes. So maybe you're in a 40 coming down to a 30, didn't spot the speed sign until the last moment, late reaction. So we've ultimately gone through that speed sign still above the limit and bring that down. Again, things the examiner would be considering there would be the effect, if any, on following vehicle, the amount of speed that was over, how far they travelled at that speed, those kind of things. If the candidate did continue at that speed and didn't actually spot the sign, we'd mark that in a different box. That would be use of speed, because it wasn't a late reaction to the sign, it was just didn't see the sign. So traffic signs, we don't see, we obviously see a lot of faults because it's in the top 10, but it tends to be probably more prominent at certain locations. You might be at a location where you think, I don't tend to see that many, depending on the area that you work in. But I think it's really important to reiterate some of the points that Amanda mentioned at the start. In terms of distractions, the fatigue element should never be under-factored there in terms of how that person's feeling at that particular time in terms of that decision making. So we move on to position normal driving, I believe, number 8. Yes, so position for normal driving, or sometimes we refer to it POS-N, because it's just easier to say. So this is an interesting one, and I think you can tend to link this in with spatial awareness, can't we? And if people generally have issues with their position for normal driving in their lane, generally you'll see traits in their distance they pass parked cars in terms of clearance. If somebody's repeatedly driving too close to the curb, and you all know as well as I do, sometimes that can be where they're looking. They're not looking far enough ahead in the centre of the lane. It can be quite often, as we all know, you tend to steer to where you're looking. So it can quite often be that. Again, asking these open questions: where are you looking? What you're seeing? Just to get that confirmation that they're looking well enough ahead. So we do see that a fair bit. Probably the more common one, I guess, under position normal driving would be unnecessarily driving in the right-hand lane of a dual carriage, where occasionally we'll see this when you exit a roundabout. The roundabout might take you off into the right-hand lane. I can think of many locations I've tested at over the years where we have scenarios like that, and then you'd be expecting the candidate to come back over to the left when it's safe, but they just hold that position. And I guess it's trying to get into their mind, and sometimes it's almost like you're thinking they want to come back, but they just won't do it. And for whatever reason that is, obviously that fault is starting to get worse and worse the longer they stay in that position. And sometimes as an examiner, trust me, you're wanting to just say to them, do you know which lane you need to be in? Because you can kind of feel like they want to be in the left, but there's something holding them back. And again, that's a conversation, isn't it? As an ADI to have with a candidate, when I'm sure you've sat in the back and you ask them after the test and they'll say, I wanted to, I just didn't do it. Again, that talking through what you're doing can be really beneficial in that situation, or hearing, your instructor's voice in your mind. Cutting across the normal road position when you go ahead at roundabouts with no lane markings. We see this one occasionally, not so much, refer to it as straight lining, I guess, don't we? And on occasion, straight lining a roundabout is fine. It might be the best course of action, but it depends on the circumstances, doesn't it? And who else is around us, and the size of the roundabout, the speed, all that kind of good stuff, which the examiner would factor into their assessment when seeing these kind of faults. I think that's it for me on number 8, so I'll hand back over to Amanda for number 9.
Sorry, take myself off mute, that might help. Okay, so number 9, not responding correctly to road markings. Got 2 left to go, so I'll whiz through them a little bit just because I'm conscious of leaving enough time for some Q&A at the end. So these ones are more about not following the direction arrows on the road. So if it's clearly laid out as to what they should be doing and they're not following them, then this would be the road markings. Straddling lanes on a roundabout, because they're not in one lane or the other, so they're not responding to the road markings that are there. Crossing double white lines where the line nearer to you is solid. It seems quite obvious, doesn't it? But that's not always the case. If there's no need to be crossing it, we wouldn't be expecting them to do so. Ignoring a box junction, again, this can come down to forward planning, looking ahead, seeing what's ahead, and sometimes they arrive in a box junction without even noticing they're in it. On roundabouts, sometimes outside a fire station down in Bournemouth was quite key at one time, and that sort of thing. So it's just looking ahead, planning that, and hoping that you don't arrive in a box junction because you haven't noticed that there is one, and not following the road markings at mini roundabouts. So people have got a little bit of a habit of going over the top of them, but if there's the room to go around them, we'd expect them to go around them, especially when they're clearly marked with the arrows on them. So we do get the odd person that as they go over them, you can see the mini roundabout out the window to your left, which is a little bit concerning. So, and the risk there's quite high, because then the roundabout's not doing what it's meant to do, and that is that traffic can move around each other. But if they're cutting off over the roundabout, then anything coming the other way doesn't have any room to manoeuvre around them. 10, not keeping control of the vehicle during reverse parking. So that's, you know, your wheels ending up on the pavement at the end of a parallel park, or they could end up, you know, quite a long distance from the target vehicle. They could end up quite a long way in the road, maybe taking quite a few attempts, so they've come back and they've pulled out, and we're not really making any difference. We're ending up back in the same place each time. They're just showing a lack of control of steering, of understanding where they want the car to go, and we can see that quite often. Losing control of the car and parking a bay, again, and it's very similar to ending up parking outside of a bay. So that's all to do with them having the understanding and the knowledge of where they want the car to go. And again, that can be really good in questioning, you know, which way do you want to steer, where do you want the car to be, where are you trying to get it, and trying to help them understand where they want that car to be. But I'm not trying to teach anyone to you know, suck eggs. It's all just about us all working together, and if we can help you or give you any guidance or help, that's what we're here to do. So I'll hand you back to Dane now. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thanks, Graham and Amanda. That's been really helpful and loads for everyone here to be thinking about, and completely don't know why we didn't think of doing it as a countdown. That would have been brilliant. So now we're going to move on to the questions and answers, and you'll see the Q&A panel is now open on the right hand side of your screen. If you need to open it, click on the Q&A little icon at the top right of your screen and you can type them in there. We're also going to keep up on a slide on the screen that just keeps a list of those top 10 reasons. There it is there with the risk factors on the right, just so you need to, in case you need to refer to them. So if you can start typing in your questions, please keep them to today's questions just to the topic of the top 10 reasons. That would be great. We're only going to sort of address those because there's quite a lot of people aren't joined this call today, so, and that probably means we won't get to everybody's question either, so we'll get through as many as we can. And just to say too, if you like another question that you see on the screen, you can actually, you'll see a little thumbs up button next to it. So if you just want to, if you kind of want to hear the answer to that as well, go and like that by pressing the thumbs up, and that will tell us which is the most sort of popular. We'll try and get to those first. So right, and so we'll try and get through as many as we can. Right, let's have a go. So question from Ashley, will you be doing this for the standard test too?
Do you think that relates to the standards check?
Maybe it could. Yes, it doesn't have any more information, so maybe that means, maybe Ashley, if you want to sort of elaborate a bit more in the chat whether you mean that. If
it is the standards checks, then yeah, there's the opportunity for us to do more of these webinars as we go forward. So if that's in something that you'd be interested in the future, then please do let us know, and we can bring in the ADI team to do that work with you if that's what you were meaning. If not, if you let me know, I'll see if I can answer it.
Excellent, I think that's probably right. And okay, so oh gosh, they're coming in thick and fast. There's several hundred people on here, so we'll try and get through as many as we can. So, David saying firstly, thank you for the presentation and the Q&A, so that you're most welcome, and we've really enjoyed putting this together. Question from Fiona, choosing the wrong lane. Oops, it keeps moving. Excuse me, I'm going to have to click on that. Choosing the wrong lane at a roundabout with clear signage. Many don't have clear signage. Signs keeps moving. Signs are covered by overgrown hedges, trees. How much support consideration is given to this situation, please? Yeah,
thanks for the question, Fiona. And it's a really good point, isn't it? Because not all signs. I think I touched on this when I was referring to it. You know, when we're designing a route at a test centre, it's really, really important that we highlight any bits that might be ambiguous. We've kind of got a little bit of a rule. It's an unwritten rule, but it's certainly one that I like, in terms of if you were directing a family or friend around that, do you think it would be reasonable to give them some extra information? And I think it's a really good kind of thing that we do when we're designing routes, in terms of if we're expecting a novice driver to you know, interpret a sign that's not that well displayed, or it's covered by something, that's totally unfair, and that you know, that would be entrapment. So we would tell the candidate which lane they need to be in. If you feel like there's anywhere around that, you know, in terms of where you do your test, then by all means raise that with the LDTM, the local driving test centre manager, because if there is anything that's ambiguous, it should be taken care of with some additional guidance from the examiner to make it absolutely clear which lane would be required. Hopefully that helps.
And I think this sort of might be related, Graham, is where does it go? If the road markings aren't clear, will the examiner give hints or help if asked by the candidate?
Yeah, it's probably exactly the same as I've just said to that previous one. So yeah, absolutely, Dane. If the road markings, I mean, listen, if it's a typical straightforward roundabout with 2 lanes and you've asked the candidate to turn right, 3rd exit, I'm not going to say you need to be in the right-hand lane. However, it's slightly more complex than that, and I'm asking you to go a specific way with multi-lanes, and they're quite confusing, and it wouldn't be, overly clear for you or I to choose, then we would intervene. So again, hopefully that helps.
Thanks for that. Next one, question from Tom. Why are instructors not allowed to record internal dash cam or sound footage? This would be helpful for candidates and protect examiners from abuse if not wearing the cameras.
Yeah, I'll take this one. That's a really good question. And I suppose you could also ask, why did DVSA not film inside the cars during driving test? There's a lot of behind the scene legislation and research and lots of work that would need to go into that. So at the moment, it's because we don't have the legislative powers to look after that, to secure the data, to understand where that data is going to go. Especially in regards to our examiners, that footage can end up anywhere and we wouldn't have any control over it. And as an employer, we have to be a bit careful about that. So it is a good question. I'm not saying it's not something that will ever happen, and we'll just carry on working through that one as we go forward.
Okay, great. Oops. And what is the tolerance of overspeed? How far and how much overspeed?
So there wouldn't necessarily be a tolerance in terms of a black and white figure. Of course, we need to have some tolerance in terms of how would you know if somebody was actually speeding, for example, in terms of if you were looking at the speedo from a different angle. However, I appreciate it might be digital, so it might be giving you a digital readout. The digital readout can sometimes take a second or two to update if that candidate's come off the gas. I suppose it's like when I've referred to in previous webinars and on this one, in terms of the defined outcome, what's perfect? Well, perfect would be doing the speed if that's safe for the road and traffic conditions. Sometimes the speed limit is too quick, isn't it? So we don't necessarily work on numbers. We work on if it's too quick or too slow for the road and traffic conditions that's happening in that particular time. Somebody could be driving at 30 and still actually get a serious fault for use of speed if it's too quick for that scenario. So whilst of course there will be some tolerance slightly above the speed limit, you could argue a legal requirement's been breached, but it's only been breached momentarily. It's a slight blip of that. So if somebody was to maintain it, the examiner would take these kind of things into account. But we don't necessarily look at the actual, number of the speed. It's more about, was that speed too quick or slow for road and traffic conditions?
Thanks, Graham. And Shaquille, bus lanes on the left. If driving in your correct lane, traffic ahead is turning right, do you have to stop until clear, or can the driver undertake in the bus lane?
Graham, do you want to take that one?
I can take that one. Now I would say don't undertake, because if you're talking about a solid white line and you're going to go into that, and some of these bus lanes now, obviously they've got cameras in, but forget that. It's about a deviation from the defined outcome again, isn't it? What would you do? That's what I'd always say to you folks. When you ask me that question, I'd throw it right back at you and say, what would you do? Because you're standing in judgment of that person. I'm pretty sure you would say don't undertake. If you're undertaking a solid white line, well, you couldn't deviate any further from the defined outcome. So you're leaving the examiner in terms of assessing that fault by thinking, right, did they just go over it because the car in front had moved across slightly? Okay, now that's not, it could be worse, because one of the other things the examiners is asking themselves, what can I add to that fault and what can I take away? So could it be worse? Could it be better? If you go completely into that bus lane, The examiner straight away is thinking, it couldn't be much worse. Of course, it's only for a couple of seconds or two, but that's not to say you wouldn't pick up a traffic offence for that. So it's very difficult. You're making the examiner's life very difficult. Don't make our lives difficult. So that is one of those things where I would, coming back to the question, yeah, I wouldn't advise anybody to do that because it's not procedurally correct.
Okay, thanks. The next one from Michael. Advanced stop lines. If moving over the first white line is a common reason for failure, why does Rule 178 of the Highway Code state if your vehicle has proceeded over the first white line at the time that the signal goes red, you must stop at the second white line, even if your vehicle is in the marked area? So if candidates cannot stop in time due to the risk from behind, and if the candidate correctly allows any cyclist to move on first, would the scenario fail then?
So no, this would be assessed by the examiner at the time. So again, it comes down to if I'm on that test as the examiner and the lights are changing and their reaction is to bring it to a stop and they're in the cycle bay because that was the safest thing to do and that's what I'd have done, then that's absolutely fine. If they're already more or less on top of it and the safest thing at that point actually would have been to carry on and they brake the car to a complete stop very quickly, very heavily, and they're in the bike bay, then that could be a different scenario because the risk there is much, much higher because the car behind may not have expected you to stop on a sixpence. So it sort of does depend on when the lights are changing, whereabouts they are on approach to it. Have they allowed for the fact that they're approaching a traffic light that's been on green for quite some time now? Are they still driving at it at the same continuous speed? Have they already started to ease off thinking actually this has been on green for quite some time, it's very likely to go red now? So what precautions have they taken? Have they allowed for that? Have they looked ahead? Have they done any of that planning? So no, we have had people on tests that have stopped in the cycle box, but that was the safest thing for them to do at that time, and that would be assessed accordingly at the time.
Great, thank you. So parking in a bay, forwards or backwards, is there a difference as to whether you can have a tyre on the line, or does that fail you?
So I mean, a tyre on the line doesn't necessarily mean it's a serious fault. Again, the examiner will be taking into account the whole procedure, the whole manoeuvre, if you like. How many times did the candidate need to readjust? Was there another vehicle in the bay next to it in terms of they got extremely close? So there's a number of factors that the examiner will take into account, but let's make it clear, it's not automatically a serious fault if the candidate finishes with a tyre on the wheel. More often than not, that would be a driving fault. Of course, again, that deviation, could it be worse? Could it be better? Well, of course it could be better. It could be in the bay, it could be in the perfect position. So we've got the tolerance, haven't we? We've got that deviation from that defined outcome. So unless the tyre is in the other bay, which we can say would be a serious fault, if there's daylight between the line, it's one of the only faults that we do have a little bit of black and white in it, even though I don't like to say that because it's all assessment at the time. But if there's daylight between the tyre and the line and the candidate leaves it in that position, well, that is a serious fault. So being on the line isn't a serious fault unless we're adding things to it, like it was the third or fourth shunt, let's say, there was other factors, a stall, whatever it may be. So hopefully, again, it is difficult talking about assessment, and I know we enjoy talking about it on these webinars and whatnot, so we hope you appreciate it, but we always need to remember you have to be there. So this is just giving you some insight, but you do have to be there.
Thanks, Graham. There's actually one here I can help with from Sam. Are there any copyright issues in terms of publishing these top 10 reasons on our websites or YouTube channels? And this is public data, so absolutely, we'll be showing the DVSA website links with Gov UK with all this information. So you're under the licensing, you absolutely are welcome to reuse these for your own websites and things like that. So that you can definitely do that. And from Nikki, do examiners always help students with oncoming emergency vehicles, or do they wait to see how the student reacts first?
So this would really depend on the situation at the time, the environment they're in, where's the emergency vehicle coming from, have they had time to see it, have they reacted to it. if by letting them to react to it, are we actually going to have an impact on that emergency vehicle and slow it down? Because obviously we don't want to be doing that, and we don't want to be stopping them from getting to do the job they're trying to do. So there are situations where we might give the candidate the opportunity to see where they're thinking and what they're going to do, and most do deal with it very well. But other situations where it comes around very quickly, or a traffic light roundabout, you know, we would give them that guidance there to, because obviously it's a stressful situation for them as well. So it really does depend on the situation at the time. But the key thing is we don't want to be getting in the way of the emergency vehicle, so we will sometimes take control a bit quicker to make sure we're out of the way. So it does depend on what's going on at the time.
Okay, and on a question as well about a PDF format of this webinar, so of the slides. So yes, we can definitely provide that. And how many attempts are too many in terms of parallel parking or bay parking?
Yeah, so again, there's no number. Unfortunately, we don't have a number. It'd be easier, wouldn't it, if we had a number? You'd say, all right, well, you allowed one go and that's it. But of course, we don't do that for the right reason, because we want to assess the whole scenario. We want to see how that person deals with it. You know, I was doing some tests last week, and I won't go into too many specifics, but it was a really nice drive, and I'm thinking, oh, we're doing the parallel park, everyone's favourite, you know, and we were getting into the second attempt, and I'm, you know, just to give you a bit of insight, I'm really, you know, on the side of this student, thinking, come on, because you're driving really well. Don't mess it up. But to answer the question, there isn't a set number, but it's about all the factors, and the factors are, well, what? Well, is it getting better? Is it getting worse? How far from the curb are you? Are you affecting other vehicles? Are you stalling? How close are you getting to the target vehicle? So there's a number of things that we take into account, but we use what we call the rules and tools of assessment. Again, coming back to this defined outcome, how far from it was it? Was there any risk involved? But ultimately, you know, we can't be there forever and a day. You know, we need to see somebody making, if they're going to do, probably the best way to sum it up, if they're going to be taking corrective shunts, they need to be making the maneuver better. You know, we quite often see somebody take a corrective shunt and they get them in such ways that they start steering the wrong way. You know, you folks see this. So the best rule of thumb is we need to see it getting better, not worse. But there's no number in terms of how many is too many.
And you mentioned straight lining roundabouts. I teach staying to the left on all. Cars behind often try to pass. Which shape of roundabouts is it acceptable to pass over in a straighter line?
It's a good question, isn't it? So I'm not sure when you say shape a roundabout what you mean by that. But as a driving instructor, I would always, if the left lane was the lane to go ahead in, I would teach them to stay in the left. And there's a few reasons for that, isn't it? Because if they remain in the left lane and they follow it around and leave in the left lane, there's less chance of anything coming up on their left. Whereas we do get people who go ahead on quite a few roundabouts from the right hand lane with there's no road markings. What they're then doing there is just making it more difficult for themselves, because now they're in the right lane, they're going ahead, but they've got to check what's on their left, be really sure of what's coming up on their left quite often, quite quickly to move across. So where you're saying there about, you know, you're teaching them to stay on the left, if that's what the road markings are there, or there's no road markings and that's the right process to be using, then that's the right thing to be doing, because that's a good skill to learn as they go forward, isn't it? So keep doing what you're doing is what I'd say. I don't know if you want to add anything in, Graham.
No, I totally agree. I guess the only thing is occasionally, because we're all picturing a different roundabout in our mind, isn't it? But let's remember what we assess to and what you folks teach to. You know, it's essential skills, best practice, highway code. There's different techniques out there, isn't there? There's ROSPA. You know, there's more progressive driving, more advanced driving, which you might take the path of least resistance, showing awareness to other vehicles. I guess the only time what I could think it would maybe be acceptable is occasionally you'll see a roundabout where there's quite a bit of gravel or dirt in the near side and candidates stay excessively to the left. You know, in those circumstances, as long as it's safe, you could maybe take a more straight line if the necessary checks were done, but you wouldn't really want to be straddling any lines. But yeah, hopefully that helps.
Okay, and I saw what view do you take on candidates steering with one hand?
Well, again, coming back to, if we're talking about best practice, essential skills, all that kind of good stuff, then steering with one hand, what scenario are we describing? We maybe sometimes picture the person who reverses with a hand on the gear stick and steers with the other. Is it somebody who's just steering with one hand into a junction? If there wasn't any reason for that, I'd be questioning why. But in terms of how we, if I was teaching that person to drive, I'd be asking them why they're doing that, and I'd be asking them what's the reason, and unless there was a good reason coming back, and I can't really think of any, I'd be explaining why we need to keep both hands on the wheel for obvious reasons of having proper control of the vehicle. But in terms of a fault, it's probably the example, it's not probably, it is, they would only assess a fault if there was any loss of control. However, it doesn't come across very well on a driving test, I don't think, if somebody's steering with one hand without due reason. However, the examiner will only assess that loss of control should it happen. Hope that helps.
I've got a really good comment here. Would appreciate a webinar for disabled people, people with special needs, and the deaf. So that's a really, really good point. We'll take that away. Can we access previous webinars? And they're all on the DVSA Gov website. There's previous webinars stored there, and also I think you'll be able to get the recordings on the DVSA's YouTube channel as well. But we can provide the links for that as well. Just going back to, excuse me, just scrolling back down. Turning right at a junction, will a student fail if they enter the hatch markings early?
That's a very difficult question to answer, isn't it, without understanding the junction. So I suppose if you're talking about one that's got its own designated right turn box, again, it depends on why have they entered them early. Was there a need to enter them early? Was there something causing them to do that? And when we can't really say pass, fail, you can't really talk about the level of fault there, because there's so many different scenarios in that situation that could affect the outcome of that, the result of that fault there. So best practice is to enter them where you should enter them, but there's so many other reasons why you may be in that area. If you're on a very busy road and you're wanting to turn right and that box is full, but by you moving into the hatch marking behind the last vehicle is the safest option for you and for what's going on around you, then that may be a possibility in that situation. But like I say, it's quite a big open question, I'm afraid, so it's difficult to answer it.
Yeah, so I've got time for one more question. I'm afraid there's been so many, and we wish, because there's been a lot of people on here, so I'm sorry if we haven't got to your question yet. This is from PDI who's just learning the ropes. How many of the same driving fault equals a serious fault?
Good question. So we're referring to an habitual, and the answer is, well, there isn't an answer, of course. The answer is it depends on the circumstances. But what I will give you, because I'll always try to answer honestly, and when we say it depends, it really does. I'm going to give you two different faults. Not checking your mirrors before you signal. Think about that fault for a moment. Then think about not checking your blind spot before moving away. Now, I think we'd all agree one of those faults is slightly more high risk than the other. If I said to you, don't check your mirror before you signal when you're turning left at the end of the road, you'd think, okay, well, that's not best practice, but in terms of the risk, it's very low. Whereas if I asked you to move away from the side of the road without just checking your centre mirror and moving away, there's some difference. So the point I'm making is every fault is different in terms of the severity of the risk. So of course, what that ultimately means is the faults that are repeated with more high risk are going to get to a serious quicker. So for example, changing lanes on a dual carriageway by only checking the centre mirror and moving into the right-hand lane. I wouldn't advise that, by the way, but we see candidates do that. Now, if there's no one else around and no one's affected, that's potentially a driving fault. But if you think about the risk of that, it's what I'd call a high-end driving fault. So I wouldn't want to see somebody do that too often without thinking, actually, this person's got a significant deficiency in this area. So those are the kind of things we think about when ultimately turning that driving repeated fault into a serious. Thanks. We really enjoy these conversations. I know Dane's going to wrap up, but I think there's an appetite for this, so I'm sure it'll not be too long before we speak to you folks again.
I could probably go on for hours more with all the questions I see that we haven't got to, but There's also in the chat box, which is a chat box icon at the top. My colleague John has just put a link to a quick little survey. If you've got a couple of moments to tell us what you thought of this webinar and what things we can do to improve them in the future. So I really appreciate if you could do that. Also, John, do you want to bring the slide up with the guide on it? A lot of what we've talked about today and all the questions we might not have gotten to, you may find in this guide, if you haven't got it already, on the screen, the official DVSA guide to better driving, and you'll see a discount code. If you order it from the Safe Driving for Life website, you'll get a 35% discount there, so it'll be $8.99 plus shipping. And just to remind you too, the question, this session has been recorded, so if you've missed part of it at the start, don't worry, we will be sharing that when it's available on our YouTube channel. So keep an eye on your inbox for a DVSA Direct that tells you when that's available. So this remains for me to thank you all for taking the time to join. I think it's been one of the busiest webinars we've had. Thanks to Amanda and Graham for presenting. Also, thanks to my team behind the scenes who have been making all the technology run smoothly. So thank you all. Have a great evening.